Do you remember the first Steam purchase that you ever made? I do. It was a neat little title you may have heard of called Garry's Mod. And for the 5 of you out there who haven't, here's a quick history. Garry's Mod started out as a sort of mod for Half-Life 2 and became its own individual release when Valve approached creator Garry Newman, turning it into a standalone sandbox experience. Now Garry's Mod is an interesting game because there's not a whole lot of game there at first glance. It's basically just a tool to open different map files and add-ons you can grab from the workshop to create, well, basically anything. It's actually pretty crazy. There's also a stupid amount of servers available, all running their own custom game modes. But before I discovered all the joys a Gmod server could bring to the table...
Hello? Hello?
I spent a lot of time on my shitty old Toshiba laptop in 2008 just messing around in the many maps available in the game and on the workshop. And this was when I first felt the existential dread of the Source engine. Gmod was a deeply unsettling experience for me as a kid, and it was so subtle that I could never even really pinpoint exactly what it was that caused it. See, for the first few minutes everything feels fine. You boot up the game, you go to GM Big City, and you start trying out the numerous tools and props available, but as soon as maybe 10 minutes in, things start to feel very off to me. There's this sense of paranoia that slowly builds when you play this game. I would begin to look around my room, become hyper aware of noises that were ruminating from inside the house, and as time goes on still, I'd start to feel like my throat was getting a little weird, like anxious almost. I remember being absolutely convinced that there was something in that map with me. I could never see it, but I could hear it. There's ambient sounds like far off traffic, people mumbling through walls, police sirens. It's all so distinguishable but never quite identifiable. No matter where I moved on that map, the noises always felt so far away, and the map itself was always so empty, just so empty. The silence in this game is deafening. It just discreetly creeps its way into your brain and convinces you that something, somewhere, is watching you. I'm not kidding when I tell you that as a kid, I had to take breaks from this game because I was just so sure I was about to be jump scared every time I played it. And no matter how many times I searched through every map and explored every crevice, I never lost that unsettling feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. But why did this game disturb me so much as a kid? Well, as many of you will know, Gmod uses the Source engine. Source is an engine developed by Valve, and a lot of extremely well-known games run on it. Counter-Strike, Portal, Half-Life, TF2, and many more all run on Source. Now, Source as an engine has a super distinct style that is really easy to spot in my opinion, and it just so happens that most games Valve developed using the Source engine give off this same sense of dread that Gmod does. Games like Portal are extremely unsettling to me. Your only company here being the robotic GLaDOS, who, in Portal 1 at least, is played pretty straight for the most part, and you have this constant lingering paranoia that something isn't right, only fueled on by the multiple Ratman dens filled with mad rambling and blood all over the walls. It's a game that, not unlike Gmod, drives you just a little bit insane as you play. Source as an engine, I think, is a lot of the reason that all these games feel as empty and paranoid as they do. This is going to sound a little bizarre, but stick with me for a moment. There is, I think, a sense of realism in Source games that still hasn't ever really been matched. Like, yeah, sure, you have games like Horizon and The Last of Us that are incredibly detailed, and Gmod looks like, well, this. But those other games still very much feel like video game worlds. They're grand, they're luscious, with dramatic lighting and huge set pieces, while Source games aren't really. Games like Left 4 Dead, Portal, or Half-Life are just so incredibly understated with such ordinary looking environments. They have like a real lack of music and very pronounced ambient sound design, and that actually ends up feeling a lot more like real life on a subconscious level.
Any undeserved compliments.
And this is where I feel that uncomfortable vibe comes from. Because as I alluded to earlier, the games don't look particularly good. especially the older ones, and when you experience such a realistic atmosphere with visuals that so do not look like real life, it becomes uncanny. It's like your brain can't quite distinguish that this is a video game and just rejects how unusual the whole thing looks. And this is definitely something I think the developers know and take advantage of. You might have noticed that most of the games I've talked about do aim to be unsettling on some level. Half-Life has a lot of horror elements to it. Portal is a psychologically charged narrative about escaping a never-ending torture chamber, and Left 4 Dead is straight up a zombie game. Hell, two of the most unsettling games I've ever played both came from Source, the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide, both created by Davey Wreden. The Beginner's Guide is one of the most bone-chilling narratives and gameplay experiences I have ever felt. Despite having its fair share of humour, the Stanley Parable also serves as a deeply unnerving experience, especially on the first few runs, with the endless beige hallways and brown doors that lead to countless different pathways and endings, some much darker and more disturbing than others.
Are you listening to me? Can you hear me? Is everything all right?
In fact, although I have absolutely no way of clarifying it, I would hazard a guess that the original Backrooms post, which would go on to become a viral horror short sensation, was probably primarily inspired by Source Engine games in particular. Because when I think of uncanny areas filled with hallways in games, Source is what comes to mind, the Stanley Parable especially. Davey himself said it best.
One of the things that it does very well is boxy linear corridors.
And Source games share another similarity with the Backrooms too. You might have heard of the term liminal space. It essentially refers to an area that feels creepy or eerie due to a sense of familiarity without the usual context. For example, a room that resembles the aesthetic of a swimming pool but without any swimmers or lifeguards. And the Backrooms as a concept is entirely based in liminal spaces and the uneasiness that familiar but uncanny objects and settings provoke in us. And Source does this too, more discreetly, but it's definitely there. See, Source reuses a lot of the same textures and objects across different games and mods, so whilst we might associate one asset with Half-Life 2, seeing it pop up in Gmod without its established context can feel off-putting. Like, you recognize that texture and it's in the same engine, so it even feels the same, but the context is just wrong, it's not supposed to be there. Source games are, in my opinion, one of the most prominent and effective examples of creating uncanny and unsettling environments in games, and it's something that Valve and other developers like Wreden take full advantage of to create some of the most unsettling games you'll ever play. And as much as they fill me with existential dread, I never want to see them stop. It's an aesthetic that only Source does so well, and to see anyone else try it would be, well, uncanny. Thank you so much for watching, and
Marvin, what do you make of all this?
Please let me know down in the comments what the most unsettling game you've ever played was. Until next time.